Hello everyone, this is a review of secularization theories and statistics to support the idea that secularization is taking place in Britain and America. And I'm just going to talk to you about some of the theories to support that idea that secularization is taking place. Firstly, if we look at the measure for secularization in Britain, you can quite clearly see that there are three key measures for this: attendance, affiliation and institutions. If we look at the figures for religious attendance, we can see that there's been a drastic decline since what's perceived as the golden age of religion in the 1800s to now, where we're at the stage where there's about 5% of the population attending church on a regular basis. If we look at who is saying they have a religious belief and who belongs to a religious organisation in terms of affiliation, in 2014 the British Social Attitudes Survey found that about 50% of people claim to not have a religion anymore. And actually in 2017, that's now risen to 53%. So for the first time ever, more people in this country claim to have no religious belief than those who do. And finally, institutions. If we look at the structural differentiation argument presented by Parsons, the functionalist, he argues that the roles and functions that religion once played have become drastically reduced. So, for example, religion would once provide education in this country. All schools were church schools until the state took over that role. Now, in the same way that the family has gone through a process of structural differentiation, so too has religion. And Parsons would argue that it's become ever more specialised and become more of a niche product for a very few to commit to. With the loss of functions, religion becomes much more inconsequential. It plays a far lesser role in people's lives. And with that process taking place, it means that the church has less influence over public life. And so it becomes smaller and smaller, and the role it plays becomes ever more reduced. If we look at what's happening in America, we see a slightly different picture here. Attendance is much higher, according to Wilson, in America with 62%. However, when we look at and we break down these statistics, what we see is that there's quite a large degree of exaggeration between who's actually attending church and who claims to be in church, as Hadaway finds. There's about an 83% gap in Hadaway's research of those who told Hadaway that they attend church on a regular basis and who then Hadaway was able to see and do a head count of in church. So we have to be careful and think about the validity or the lack of validity that these statistics hold if we're still claiming that attendance in America is high. Bruce presents this argument of religious diversity as a measure for secularization in America, that the church once had a monopoly which has now drastically declined as more and more religious groups now emerge in America and live side by side. It gives rise to people starting to question which religion is the most true, which religion holds the monopoly of truth. Why is my religious belief any more valid than the person next door? Now, these kind of questions all rise when you get religious groups living side by side and people become more exposed to different ways of thinking. The monopoly that the Christian church once had, therefore, is then eroded, and where you get so much diversity and choice of religious belief, it means that the church has a far less stronghold over people's lives. Finally, Bruce presents the argument of secularization from within, that religion has become much more like a therapy now. The message of religion has become watered down, so the church can no longer rely on promoting religious views such as the belief in miracles, for example, which just is not acceptable to a large portion of the population. And so instead, the church will try to reduce its message down to a form of therapy and focus on issues like love and compassion as a way of still attracting people. Bruce would argue in that case, it's not so much a religion anymore, it's more of a secular form of religion that people are still attracted to. Now, moving on to why this takes place. If we look firstly at Weber's argument of rationalization and disenchantment, he presents an argument much like really in keeping with what Bruce has mentioned about the diversity and competing ideas in society? Well, Weber argues that actually it's science that religion had to compete with, and the rise of rational and scientific thinking that emerged from the Protestant Reformation. Because of this rise in rational and scientific thinking, as he calls it, the enchanted world that the Catholic Church once had, the hold it had over society and the claims of truth that it once had, become eroded, and people start to look for a more rational and scientific explanation as to why things occur rather than a religious one. So Weber argues that we've gone through a process of disenchantment because of the Protestant Reformation, that God now becomes transcendent, that he is no longer part of the universe, but actually instead he created the world, created the laws of nature, and left us to it. In which case, we can understand the workings of the world through a more scientific prism. We understand that gravity works on us, for example. We understand that because it's one of the laws of nature. That means that there's no room for scientific thinking, according to Weber, because we don't need it. We have a scientific and rational understanding of how the world works. And so we lose that sense of being part of an enchanted garden, and we go through a process of disenchantment. There's a very, very similar view presented here by Bruce and the technological worldview, that where we once looked for a religious explanation for events in the world, we now have a scientific one. And so if a plane crashes, for example, we understand that not as an act of God, but actually because there was a fault with the engine, for example. That means that religion only really plays a role where science is lacking. If science can't provide that answer, then religion steps in. But this means that religion is taken far less seriously and has a very, very small role to play only in the absence of science. Moving on to the arguments of diversity here, going back to Bruce's argument about diversity here, this time social and cultural diversity, he would argue that during the process of industrialization, where there was once small, close-knit communities who all would hold the same belief system, and within that there would be a strong religious belief system, with the breakup of these communities due to industrialization, with people moving across the country to find places to work in new factories, for example, that meant that that sense of community started to break down, and the value consensus that they all maintained, the shared belief in religion too, gets broken up, and so that value consensus is lost. These smaller communities now make way for much larger communities, and it's much, much more difficult for larger communities to have that hold over us, that value consensus, when there's so many competing ideas. With the influx of new cultures due to immigration, people start to be exposed to a range of belief systems. That means they become much more individualized, and people start to look at what's around them and adopt bits of that for themselves and to construct an identity for that for themselves. It means, therefore, that they're less reliant on their community to tell them how to believe, and much less reliant on community practice. People now are able to partake in any individual belief that they wish, and they will do it as an individual rather than as part of a community. So with the influx of different belief systems, with the influx of different people coming into the country, it means that the way in which we're exposed to different belief systems has a decline, has a negative effect upon value consensus and religious belief. Religious diversity too clearly plays a role in this, as identified by Berger. He argues that there's been a decline in the sacred canopy, the religious bonds that maintained the whole of society. Society once had a monopoly of truth that held the whole of society together. Well, that canopy has now been broken. The Catholic Church doesn't have this absolute truth, this absolute majority of belief and monopoly of belief over the whole of society. The Reformation led to a breakaway from this monopoly. You now have the church split into two. So there's now two competing religious belief systems. As society becomes much more fragmented with the introduction of new religious belief systems, with the influx of immigration, it means we have what Berger calls a plurality of life worlds, that there are different ways of interpreting the truth because we're exposed to so many different competing ideas of what religious truth is. It might be Buddhist, it might be Hindu, etc. That means that religion's plausibility structure, i.e. the reasons why people believe it, becomes much reduced and undermined. It no longer has a plausibility structure when there are so many competing ideas there. There can't just be one single belief system anymore when there's so many religious diverse groups. That means people start to question religion and question which one is true and which one should they be part of, and actually, is there alternative explanations out there for them to seek? With that, people start to question the fundamentals of religion and really, which one is true, which one can I believe in, and it deters people from retaining their religious belief. And finally, if we look at postmodernist argument here, Bryman argues that religion has become Disneyfied, that it has become watered down, trivial, simplified as a way of appealing to people within a consumerist market. People are now much more able to experience choice and diversity in a postmodern society, and so religion has to try to sell itself. It has to try and cater for that market. Bryman argues that religion, as a result of this, has declined enormously, and it becomes nothing more than a trivial act. It's very simplified. The original message has been completely lost and watered down, and it's little more than a joke. We can use Lyon's research to point to an example of this, the Harvest Day Crusade that took place in Disneyland, as a way of trying to promote religion to those who were on holiday at Disney. Now, Lyon would argue that it's a way of religion trying to appeal to a consumerist market. These people are on holiday, they're experiencing Disney, and so actually it's a good place for religion to try to compete and try to sell itself as a product for people to buy into. And it's repackaged in a very friendly, inoffensive way. They might not promote religious teachings, for example. They might not promote the idea of the resurrection of Jesus. They might instead emphasize messages about Jesus in a very relaxed, informal, inoffensive way, and talk about him as a person, and talk about his message of love and sharing, etc. It's a way of trying to bring religion into a market as a product to be sold and consumed. But what Bryman would argue is that actually the consequence of doing that is that you lose the message, you lose the religious message. It becomes nothing more than a shell of religion. It has all the likeness of religion, but really the substance is missing. And so secularization takes place as the religious message is lost, and people see religion now as nothing more than a trivial joke.